I am Kirsty Hoyle. I'm the CEO of Metabolic Support UK. We are a patient organisation and we support people living with, it's actually closer to 2,000 metabolic conditions. And we estimate that we make up around just shy of 20% of the rare disease community. Our conditions are very disparate in terms of in terms of life expectancy, symptomology, treatment access. So although we are a disease area specific organisation, we do consider ourselves a reasonable microcosm of the wider rare disease community because they are so varied, the conditions that sit under our auspice. We're an umbrella group, which is an interesting place to sit because there are many conditions in our space, nominally under our auspice, that have excellent existing patient groups. So we work in partnership with and signpost to those groups. However, the majority of our conditions don't have any other group, and that's where we step in. So it's very important to us. And we've been going almost exactly the same amount of time as I have. I'm just slightly younger, which makes me feel good. Slightly. So what do we do? I won't overlabour this, as not only do most of you hopefully have some idea of who we are, but you do similar things yourself. But we provide individual support, so people who are diagnosed with one of our conditions. Out of the 10 conditions on the newborn screening, now they've added tyrosinemia. 7 of those are inherited metabolic conditions. So we're quite often the first port of call for people who've done a panicked Google in their car, alongside other organisations such as NSPKU. So we provide individual support, and that might look like helping someone fill out a PIP assessment. It might be helping somebody with emotional support whose marriage is having trouble because of the impact of living with a rare disease on the family. And it might also look like inviting people to our community conference to meet each other, which we did last weekend, and a number of you are in here. Good to see you again. We also do advocacy work, so we are very interested and involved in policy, and we work a lot with Beacon and Genetic Alliance and other people in the sector, as we're very interested in the systems that surround our community, not just responding to those systems, which is what I want to talk about today. We build communities as well, and as I say, we signpost to others, and we're also very interested in health technology assessments. The IMD space has pockets of interest. So we have some conditions that are very popular and have a number of treatments being developed for them. And then we work with commercial partners and others to ensure access to treatment. But we also work on trying to get attention to the conditions where there is no current interest, which is impossible. But we're trying to increase our work in that area. But today I've very kindly been invited to talk about this subject. So living with a rare disease in an inequitable landscape, how fair is our system? So I'm going to briefly touch on what I mean by inequity today. It's a very broad topic. Who gets what? Why? Is this fair? And what role do we play in this? The capitalisation is a mistake. I'm not shouting, being like, why? Well, what role do we play? Or maybe I am. We'll see as we go through. So sorry if that scared anyone or jumped at that. Everyone's on the phones like, what did she say? Oh my God, is it me? Oh my God. Sorry. So when we talk about inequity, I think sometimes there can be a bit of a knee-jerk. I've seen this in many meetings and spaces I've been, a knee-jerk to think about differences in the way that people's bodies look or behave in certain spaces, okay? And I know that is part of this. It's very important. But what I want to talk about today is not the inequities within the rare disease space. I want to talk about the inequities of rare disease in comparison to other spaces. Yeah, I know that this afternoon this topic is being covered in more depth, so I'm sure that people will be getting into things like social determinants. You know, is your race, your economic background, your socioeconomic background, are they a form of an area that might cause you inequity? But I mean having a rare disease as opposed to a more common condition. That's what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. So I really hope that's clear. Because I think sometimes when you talk about inequity, you focus on one area and all anybody in the audience can think is, what about? what about this? What about that? What about this? So this is what I'm focusing on. And the reason is actually that inequity is not just a moral failure, but a scientific failure. That's how I think is my sort of guiding light for the rare disease community. I think it's Aristotle who is misquoted. She says, pretending she knew it off by heart. The worst form of inequity is to try and make unequal things equal. And that's why I don't want to talk about the rare disease ecosystem on its own, because it isn't equal. So if you're saying, well, if you're poor or rich, how do we make this bit more equal? Well, it isn't equal to start off with. So let's look bigger. That's the angle that I'm coming in today. Okay, so I'm just going to touch on a few different areas. So I'm talking about access to treatment, identity and power, and then patient groups and how we intersect with inequity in our system. So first of all, I'm going to touch on regulation. So the ABPI is the organisation that regulates patient organisations and people living with rare diseases, their relationship or lack of directly with understanding and having engagement with pharmaceutical companies. And I think it's very interesting that we don't have many conversations that discuss the status quo. We accept the status quo, whereby there is a very, very firm line between what commercial partners can do in the UK comparative to other countries. And I think as patient organisations, we should take a bit more ownership over this relationship. And we should be questioning, not challenging, but questioning, is regulation friend or foe? I was speaking to someone who's quite senior in this sector, and I was raising the issue and saying, look, a lot of this regulation is based on a book from, is it 1962, I think? And is this the best thing for our community? You know, we have this area where we can't really say it, but patient organisations, we can say what we want. We can talk about treatment developments. We can talk about things that our community really, really want to know, but the people who are developing them aren't. And someone said to me, oh yes, but what we don't want is a US direct-to-consumer model. Absolutely not. And I thought, says who? You know, and I don't, and I'm not suggesting, by the way, I'm not placing value on these, but I don't think there is enough discursive conversation around what we get, what we're allowed to hear. And I do think there is an opportunity in the UK for patient organisations and people living with rare diseases to have more agency in conversations around what they are or aren't allowed to hear, and to question whether the model is paternalistic or not. And one of the reasons I say this is I know families who are desperate for information who, unless they make it a full-time job to find that information, cannot easily get hold of it. So it's just something that I'd like to proffer. Also, spending. We never talk about the NHS. We talk about the NHS as a sacred cow, and, you know, but does it have its own protected interest at heart? We don't challenge if this system works for people living with a rare disease. We accept it as the status quo, and we try to work within these preset barriers. For example, access to treatment. You know, we never, patients do, people living with do, but as a sector, we don't really have the conversation about what it's like to live in America and want access to treatments comparative to how it is to live in the UK. And I think if you look at, what is it around, by some estimates, 40% of NHS spending is on preventable conditions comparative to 10% on rare diseases. Is this fair? Is this ethical? Is this a conversation that would be interesting to have? And that's something that I'd really like us to start looking at as a sector, to take more agency over these decisions. Yeah, and does the NHS structure work for the few or the many? Yes, it does work. I think I don't know how many of you live with a long-term rare condition, but what I would say is that particularly over the COVID period, when people are clapping on the doorstep and the NHS became a socio-political football, it's been very, very difficult to have open discursive conversations about its fit for purpose for different communities. And I know that some of our communities would love to be more critical or more open, but they don't feel that they can, because criticising the NHS has become a political argument, which is not, it only serves the purpose of the NHS itself, not the communities which support and fund it. Again, I'm not giving an opinion either way, but I would like to encourage more opportunity for discussion on these points. Also, fair portion of funding. Okay, so if you're spending all your cash on preventable conditions, right, there's an ethics argument to that potentially. And what do we get from social care then? So we can't get treatments. So do we get better treatment in social care? Is it easier for us to get benefits? No, because no one knows what our conditions are, and it's really difficult. So where are we getting benefit as a community? I think that's something that's really important that we start to look at. Okay. So identity and power as well. So in terms of inequity, I think there's something particular to the rare disease community that we don't necessarily understand things like the Equality Act. You know, when I meet communities, particularly newly diagnosed communities, there is often, and this is anecdotal, I don't have data for this, but there's often a kind of burden of, I am poorly, I am somebody who needs to be fixed in a system in which can't fix me because there aren't many of me. And who does that serve? That serves the system. It doesn't serve those individuals. So what I'd really like to see, and we're doing this with our Living Well movement, thank you for mentioning that earlier today, Nick and Rick, is to try and encourage people to understand that the Equality Act and disability identities, that you have rights. You have rights, and if we move to more of a rights-based healthcare system rather than a kind of gratitude model of thank you so much for the, you know, the crumbs that are bestowed upon me, as somebody living with rare, I think that we would start to see some progression for our community, or at least a challenge. Under the rare disease framework, I mean, it's excellent that it's been extended. That's great. But the reality is, you know, it's not hugely tangible as a framework. And also, I haven't seen an evaluation. Did it work? Did it not? You know, we've agreed to extend it, and that's excellent. But did it work? Does it work? What do we actually get from it? I'm not sure that I've heard a very clear answer to that. And so we need to be mindful of that rather than being grateful again on this gratitude model for the fact that it even exists. We should be asking for more. I know this is a bit miserable, isn't it? I'm sorry, but it's just designed to, you know, start some conversations. Not all crap, I promise. There's loads of good stuff. And the UK comparative to the most of the world is good, but I do think these are important. So something that I'm very interested in is the opportunity for people who want to be able to kind of conflate the very strong disability rights movement in the UK and rare disease sector and community. Because I think the reality is for 95% of people, there is no treatment. So this push for treatment, talking about treatment access all the time, is to effectively disengage from the reality of 95% of people living now, not in the future, now. And so rejecting a kind of medicalized notion of living well, and by that I mean having a body that is not sick, that is non-disabled, and normalising a system that supports and conflates that need for health and social care support would mean that we're all able to live well, and also people with a rare disease can get more from different pockets of kind of the statutory sector. Okay, so where do we sit in this? So as we've seen today, the strength of patient organisations and, bluntly, mums, you know, I don't know if that's come to anybody else today, but I was just seeing, and I am one, and I am a mum of a child with a rare disease, but mums, there's something that is really wonderful and passionate about that, but it does mean that all conditions don't get the same treatment. They're not all born equal. Cash, this is one of the big issues. Funding leaving function. There is an inequity if you're born with a rare disease in the UK, depending on whether or not there is a good patient organisation that supports your condition, not only in terms of you getting support, but also realistically, sometimes, depending on the science, whether or not you're going to get research in your area. You know, if you've got, you know, if your dad is a barrister and his best mate is, you know, a GOSH consultant from when they're at Cambridge, let's be honest, you've probably got more of a chance of getting some interest in your condition than someone is who is in a less privileged position. I was shocked when I first came to rare because I kind of thought there'd be a plan somewhere, you know, like, oh, we'll get these conditions done and then we'll move to the other ones. And I realised that the majority of the time, you know, there's a scientific discovery, or it's just a bit of luck, or knowing the right people that means you get off the ground. Also, we're fighting each other. You know, we're, as an umbrella group, sometimes we work with organisations that don't want us to meet people they know because they're funding them to do certain work. And maybe we would, you know, do the same. There is commercial competition around patient organisations that we don't really speak about, but that can put us in competition with each other, that can actually negate the opportunities for our community to progress and for research to happen. We all know it happens, and it's something that we really do need to address. Also, funding leading function. There is inequity built into our system because sometimes patient organisations do work they can get funded for. And this is, again, we all do it, but sometimes that's what you have to prioritise because you have to exist. So again, we're kind of a protected interest organisations, sometimes ourselves. And also government relationships and expectations. We have to be experts, right? So we do a lot of work in health technology assessment, some of the early access schemes that our colleague from Red Thread and others spoke about this morning. So we have to go to NICE meetings and be completely independent. So we have to do loads of work, support those communities to do work, make sure they're not out of pocket, but we can't be paid for it, you know? We can't be paid for it. So where do we go back to? We go back to mums, and therefore mums sometimes who have, and back to individualised engagement and leaders and founders, patient organisations where those families can afford not to work or to have one parent who doesn't work. And that's where we start to see that privilege and inequity baked in, even though we are the good guys, you know, and that's really complex. So just kind of to finish up, also value. I don't know how many of you ever get challenged as patient organisations. I think there's often a lot of quiet dismissal. You know, we don't often get challenged. We can be very myopic in our focus on our particular condition and our race for a treatment for our condition. But we're never challenged on the ethics of that or necessarily encouraged to bring ourselves together. And that's possibly because we're being quietly dismissed rather than being agreed with all the time. And I think, you know, we are asked to be patient experts, but then when we get a bit too much, we're a problem patient. And it takes a lot of understanding and experience to understand where that line's drawn. And not everybody has the opportunity to do that. I do, because I'm paid full time to be in my job. But again, that is a privilege that is not afforded to many. Also, the sector we work in. How many of you work with CROs? So, you know, agencies, consultancies who do work? Yeah, a couple of hands going up. So, yeah, and you know, there are some great organisations out there. But increasingly, I'm starting to see the value of organisations like ours doing the work ourselves. You know, we have agencies who come to us who do work on behalf of pharmaceutical companies and others. And what they want to know is how our community think and feel. So they get paid to ask us, and we get bobbins, you know, and this, I'm not just talking about money, I'm talking about value. The real value is us, but that value is hidden behind a business suit because that is perceived as real. Yeah, they're a proper, they've got a big website, they've got proper people, whereas we are patient organisations. So I'm not sure if our sector, some of these agencies always give us agency. So I encourage my colleagues to start putting in paywalls and also doing the work yourself, okay, and raising the standard of how we represent our community's voice, because that will reduce some of the inequities we see about the patient voice. Okay, so I think I'm nearly at the end. I've got 1 minute. Okay, fine. So the future. I'll just whiz through this. What does the NHS 10-year plan hold for us? And the reason I've mentioned this, it hasn't been brought up a lot today. I thought it would, so I wouldn't need to do a preface. But essentially, something that I noticed in the NHS 10-year plan, which is already rolling now, is that we're not really in it, rare disease, which is quite worrying. Yes, we've got the rare disease framework, but the NHS 10-year plan focusing a lot on genomics. And I know Nick mentioned that earlier. Personally, quite excited about it because I think democratising information and sharing power, i.e. telling people what they've got and understanding, is a way of reducing inequity, particularly in the healthcare system when there's this hierarchy of doctor knows best. You know, information is shared only as and when it's deemed appropriate for you. I think there's some democratisation happening, which is really exciting, but there's also an ethics issue. Also prevention. We have inherited diseases. We support people with inherited diseases. So this big focus on prevention goes back to my point about what is the NHS spending on? It's not spending on inherited diseases because they can't be prevented. Lots of arguments to that, but broadly. And money also, if the UK is becoming less attractive for commercial partners, you know, where we need people like that to help us exist, okay? So, you know, there is a disincentivization for people bringing treatments to the UK, which has a direct impact on patient organisations, whether that is palatable or not. Localised services for a tiny patient population, is this really the best thing for our community? And overall, with the 10-year plan for us, we don't necessarily feel that what's planned improves inequity for people living with a rare IMD in particular, and we look forward to opportunities to improve that. So thank you very much for letting me speak and for giving you all my thoughts, and yeah, appreciate your time.